Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each week to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. And there's really only one place to start tonight, and that's the reportedly impending return to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Let's take a few steps back to see how we got to where we are today and what that means for Israel, what Israel is doing, and what it means domestically, politically, and diplomatically. Well, first of all, recently the Europeans, as we know, the Iranian negotiations is Iran on one side, the P5+1, which is the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the UK, the US, France, China, and Russia, plus Germany, negotiating with Iran on a return to the 2015 JCPOA that, as we know, former US President Donald Trump removed the US from. This is an attempt at the return, which has been ongoing for at least a year, if not longer. A couple of weeks ago, or recently, the EU members, led by the EU diplomatic leader Borrell, basically sent the Iranians a take it or leave it draft. Now, usually in take it or leave it, it means just that. This is the agreement. You either take it or leave it. It clearly wasn't, because they allowed the Iranians to make significant changes to that. The changes were sent back to the Europeans. The Europeans didn't dismiss them, these changes. They sent them on to the US for their comments. The US sent their comments back to the Europeans, which sent it on to the Iranians. And the Iranians have reportedly tonight confirmed that they've received the US comments on their comments on the EU's take it or leave it, if you can follow all that. Reportedly, the 2 major sticking points to return to the deal were left out of the Iranian comments or rebuttals or whatever you want to call it on the EU's draft of the deal, the so-called take it or leave it. The first one is that ever since President Trump basically made the Iranian Revolutionary Guards one of the main bodies in Iran, and one which has basically been accused of sowing not just discord at home. Obviously, it rules with an iron fist, helps the regime, the Ayatollahs rule with an iron fist, but also has its arms, its tentacles in Yemen, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere. And reportedly has been behind attempted assassinations of former senior American officials like John Bolton, and even reportedly with the person who stabbed Salman Rushdie recently. There was talk a few months ago of the Biden administration removing them from the terrorist designation. And reportedly, Israel, when finding out, got incensed by that and made the case to the Biden administration, which certainly walked that back. If we remember, we talked about this a few months ago. The chief of staff, the US chief of staff, was the first one to say that he does not recommend removing it from the list of terrorist organizations, which allowed the Biden administration to come down, claiming that it never intended to. But clearly, there was no smoke without fire, as they say. So that's one of the major sticking points. The Iranians demanded at one point that was going to be a key demand, that the Revolutionary Guards would be taken out of that list of designated terrorist organizations. That reportedly is not in the draft that the Iranians sent back to the Europeans. The second point, just as important, is currently the IAEA, the international nuclear watchdog, launched an investigation against Iran. As we know, the IAEA has been following Iranian nuclear ambitions for a number of years. They've had cameras, certain places they're allowed to do spot checks, etc., etc. Well, they found nuclear material at a site which was not designated or allowed to be involved in the nuclear research, and the Iranians have not been able to give a credible answer as to why that was. The IAEA head has basically said that this is an investigation. The Iranians have not given a credible answer, and the investigation is ongoing. This has obviously embarrassed the Iranians, and Iran did make a demand at one point, it seems, that the investigation would be halted before return to the nuclear deal. That, again, is reportedly not in the latest draft, but we're hearing coming out from Tehran that they say it may not be in the agreement, but we will not implement the agreement until that particular demand has been met. So those two sticking points, reportedly the major sticking points, are no longer in the latest round of drafts. It does seem that we are very, very close. All the noise seems to be that we're very, very close to a return to the JCPOA. Certainly in Israel, there was a feeling that we're very close. Prime Minister Yair Lapid held a press conference today for foreign reporters, where he basically said this is a terrible deal. He laid out some of the problems that Israel has, most reportedly that this is going to give sanctions relief to the tune of $100 billion a year. Alternate Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who we actually haven't heard from pretty much since he resigned, came out because he's supposed to have the case or the file in the Israeli government to deal with the Iranian issue. And he came out and quoted the number $250 billion. So I guess he's probably talking more over a number of years. But certainly that's a massive cash injection to the Iranian economy if this deal will be signed. And while the Iranians may say we need that for our economy, for education, for health, and for things like that, it is clear over the years those people have been following what the Iranians have been doing, that much of that budget will be used to buttress their nefarious work in the region. As I said, funding terrorist organizations, terrorist regimes, pushing against Sunni influence, trying to win over as many states, this sort of Shiite crescent that has long been spoken about, that is certainly coming together quite nicely for the Iranians. And a return to the agreement would free up a lot of money for these regional ambitions that the Iranians have long held at an extremely crucial time. If you look at all those countries which have at least a big part under Iranian influence, it's very, very crucial times with Lebanon really facing a massive economic downturn. In Yemen, the civil war continues. In Iraq, it's a very crucial time with Iranian-backed forces, political forces there, making power plays. And Syria, as we know, continues to be very much under the influence of Iran. So, the Israeli argument is that this is the worst time possible to be giving them sanctions relief, etc. Yair Lapid made that point. He made the point again strongly that Israel is not against any agreement. Israel is against this agreement. They do not feel, Israeli officials do not feel that the West has got enough from Iranian bad intentions over the years. The fact that Iran has pretty much reached weaponized enrichment. There is a talk of returning to the original limits, which I think are 3.25 or 3.75, which are extremely low enriched uranium. But the question is what happens to all that has been enriched to much higher percentages, to possible nuclear weapons level enriched uranium. That's the big question, because even if they do go back now to only enriching to a very low percentage, what's going to happen to all that's happened before? Another point that Israel makes is what about the Iranian ballistic missile program, which would obviously be extremely necessary to weaponize the nuclear, the uranium to fit for a supposed nuclear weapon a little bit down the line. Also, this idea that the Americans were touting at the beginning of the Biden administration that the return to agreement would be longer and stronger. We've noticed that there's been far less, if any, voices touting that any longer. It's not longer, and it's certainly not stronger. And this certainly worries Israel. It's certainly also playing out domestically, alongside Yair Lapid holding his press conference. Former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also held a press conference today. It's not like those days where, as Prime Minister, everything that he said would be, would stop the news on all the major news channels. None of them featured it. It barely made a blip because of everything else that's going on in the Israeli media. But he certainly laid out the case, also politically saying that this is a worse deal than the first one, because obviously, as we know, it was under his tenure that the first one was agreed under former President Obama. As we remember, Netanyahu went to Congress to try and stop the deal and really went to great lengths, failing to do so. So he's certainly trying to make political hay out of this, and will certainly play into his supporters who believe that this government is weak and doesn't stand up to the Americans. What we also know is that the National Security Advisor Haluta is in Washington trying to argue against the agreement, or at least at this point influence it in some way. Benny Gantz, the defense minister, is leaving, I think, tonight or tomorrow for Washington also to meet with the leader of CENTCOM, a Central Command, the US, that Israel has been placed under. It was moved from the European command to the more Middle East regional one. So obviously very important discussions that are going to take place over the next few days on Iran especially, and Israel will continue making its case why this is a bad agreement, why even if this agreement is to be signed, that some of the aspects or facets have to be changed. Lapid has spoken to the leaders in Germany and France over the last couple of days, and various levels in the UK to try and influence. There is a belief that the Chinese and Russians, for obvious reasons, cannot be influenced. So they're trying to influence the US primarily, but secondarily also the Europeans. Moving on a little bit during the last few minutes of my opening remarks to the internal political situation. We had a bit of a bombshell. Again, as I've laid out, I think before in previous webinars, the Israeli polling scene is very much dictated according to the media interests. As I've said, some of the pollsters in Israel, the first question they ask is, what kind of results do you want to see? And the fact that there are polls released, if not daily, every couple of days, at least a couple of times a week, shows that there is a great feeling on behalf of the media that polls are of great interest to the public. That obviously is a debate, but obviously when you're releasing polls so often, you have to make them interesting. So tonight's major headline was that Bezalel Smotrich of the Religious Zionist Party, a major part of a potential future Netanyahu government, did not pass the electoral threshold. Now, why that's most interesting is because, as we know, in the last elections, Smotrich's Religious Zionist Party ran with Otzma Yehudit, Jewish power, perhaps you would translate it, of Itamar Ben-Gvir. Itamar Ben-Gvir is certainly the rising star of Israeli politics. The far-right leader is polling anything from 7 to 9, while he sees his erstwhile former partner, Smotrich, struggling either just above the electoral threshold or, as tonight we saw, below. Now, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir were negotiating up until recently, at least, to run together again. And a couple of weeks ago, Ben-Gvir offered to have 4 seats in the top 10 and perhaps even negotiate on the 4th. And Smotrich didn't want this deal. He wanted to see what kind of lineup he would have in his primaries. He had the primaries this week. His sitting members of Knesset pretty much continued at the top of the list. Nothing really changed there. But what has changed now is Ben-Gvir's position. He's got greater leverage. And he's basically been saying what's been called in Israel the zipper offer, which means Smotrich gets number 1, Ben-Gvir gets number 2, and then Smotrich and Ben-Gvir trade off each position. So now Ben-Gvir is asking for 5 out of the top 10. He's also asking to be added to the name of the party. These days, parties officially are the names of the parties, plus the leader. So it would be the Religious Zionists led by Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. That's certainly not something that he has ever mentioned in the last year or so since that partnership first developed. So it's clear that Ben-Gvir feels pretty confident. As I said, it's possible that he could end up being the fourth largest party after Likud Yesh Atid and the Machaneh Mamlechti of Benny Gantz and Gideon Sa'ar and Gadi Eisenkot. And that is certainly a major, major step forward. And it seems like the cards are very much back in Ben-Gvir's hand. Ben-Gvir did say, I think it was 24 hours ago, that he gives Smotrich 48 hours to respond to this demand, the zipper offer, as it's been called in the Israeli media. But it's clear that Ben-Gvir certainly likes this situation, is very happy about this situation, and likes to see perhaps Smotrich will squirm at reading those results tonight. According to those close to him, he doesn't really believe this poll. His poll is showing that his party is doing quite well, and other polls have certainly shown them doing as well as 6 or 7, almost equal to what Ben-Gvir is doing. So despite the headlines, Smotrich doesn't feel that much pressure. I still do believe that they want to run together. And certainly former Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to put a lot of pressure, as much as possible, for them to run together, because he doesn't want to take any risk. Because as we saw in the poll tonight, if Bezalel Smotrich does not pass the electoral threshold, then he gets something at 57 or 58, which pushes him further away from that 61. So for him, it's absolutely imperative that the two run together. Finally, something which is probably but just behind Iran, or maybe even ahead of Iran, talked about in Israel, is a potential teacher strike ahead of the opening of the school year on September 1st. Now, why this is important to politics, because it's a big play here by Avigdor Lieberman, the finance minister. At the moment, it's the finance ministry, which is seen up against the leaders of the teachers' union. As we know, in Israel, it's a byproduct of Israel's socialist past that unions still have a certain amount of, or quite a lot of power, and the teachers' union have a lot of power. They're saying that they will strike at the beginning of the year if their demands for higher salaries are not met. Avigdor Lieberman wants to make it more of a merit-based rise in salaries rather than just the length of time a teacher's been in their job. If they get good results, if their students get good results, they should be rewarded. It should be meritocracy rather than just the amount of time. They also want to align some of the school holidays with the days that people get off during the year. In other words, the Jewish holidays, et cetera, et cetera. These are all very reasonable demands. But the leader of the teachers' union, who wield tremendous amount of power and tremendous PR budgets, are basically making the case that that none of these demands by the foreign minister are reasonable, and all they want is a raise in the salary, and the school year will not start without it. As one can imagine, with a couple of months for elections, there's a lot of worry that this could hamper many parties in the current coalition. So Prime Minister Yair Lapid has tried to take the reins of these negotiations a little bit. Education Minister Shasha Biton has criticized Lieberman, as has Health Minister Nitzan Horowitz and Zev Elkin, who's the Jerusalem minister as well. So there's a lot of pressure on Avigdor Lieberman to wilt here, to give the teachers' union pretty much whatever they want, so the school year starts, so people will not go angry into the election period. It's a big power play. We'll have to see how this works it out. Knowing Avigdor Lieberman, he will not want to wilt. He said, the only way I'm compromising on this is if you fire me. And it really is, we'll see what happens. If he manages to get his way, then certainly it will put him in good stead in the upcoming elections. If he backs down, if he's forced to back down, perhaps by some of his coalition partners, then certainly that will not help his stalling election campaign, because he's stuck pretty much at 5, at most 6, according to all polls. So it's not a major international diplomatic event, but certainly one that's discussed around the dining room tables in Israel, and certainly one that, if it's not worked out amicably, could impact on the elections ahead. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much. The first question is from Eric. When the original Iranian deal was made in 2015, much of the deal would sunset in 2025. Is that still the case? And Carrie Hillebrand follows up. Has the Biden administration offered any response to how to handle sunset clauses?
Well, it's pretty much, from what my understanding is, it's pretty much a return to the original agreement. There's no extension. It's not, as I said, longer or stronger, which is something that Biden officials and their cheerleaders were touting at the beginning of the return to negotiations at the beginning of the Biden administration. And my understanding is it's pretty much a return to the timetable. And that's why some in Israel are saying that Iran could return to major elements of a nuclear weapon program within only a couple of years.
Thank you so much. An anonymous attendee asks, Gantz and others are arguing against the renewed JCPOA. Are the Arab nations not doing the same? Is there anything specific that Sunni Arab countries are doing to bolster Israel's objections?
Well, it's not, they're not, they wouldn't be, if they're objecting, it certainly wouldn't be because of Israel. They have their own grievances, they have their own worries. And interestingly, again, you can sometimes gauge where things are going by how the moderate Sunni nations are reacting. And we've seen a return of the UAE ambassador to Tehran for the first time in many years, which gives a signal that some in the Sunni region are starting to understand that, you know, Iran is gaining a little bit of its power back, potentially, with the return to the JCPOA, and they do not want to be necessarily, you know, we've talked in the past about this concept of a strong horse in the Middle East, and many of those pragmatic Sunni nations wait to see who is, strong in the region during the Trump regime, where a lot of emphasis was put on the Sunni regimes, on Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and even the Abraham Accords. Then, you know, there was a very, very good and strong relationship, and these nations felt a lot more comfortable going against Iran. Now it seems that Iran are negotiating its way back to JCPOA and going to get sanctions relief, and certainly the pressure on Iran will lessen. So we see signs that these moderate, pragmatic Sunni nations are understanding the way the wind is blowing. They are still adamantly against the deal. They would be voicing their own opinions. They will not be as loud as Israel's. They will be more quiet behind the scenes, more diplomatic, one could argue, but they're certainly no less worried about a return to this deal, not least for the potential nuclear weapons at the end of it, but also the sanctions relief, because as one can imagine, Iran that's fighting these countries' interests all over the region will suddenly get a massive cash injection. So certainly they will be making their this known to the Americans and the Europeans and even the Russians and the Chinese. They'll probably have a little bit more leverage than Israel does with those two last nations, but they'll certainly be doing it a lot more quietly than Israel is.
Absolutely. Robert Larrick asks, regarding the Iranian deal, what are the motives for the Europeans? The money flowing into Iran for more missiles and instability threatens them and their oil supply, does it not? It's not just nukes alone. That isn't the problem, is it?
Well, first of all, there is a belief. It's a sincere belief. Israel certainly disagrees with it, but there is a sincere belief that this is the best way to stop an Iranian nuclear weapon. That's what the Europeans believe. That's what the Biden administration believes. That is a sincere belief. Israel disagrees with it, but they don't believe that there's any nefarious intentions there. Certainly, everybody would prefer for some of these other elements to be put in about, you know, the terrorist proxies, et cetera, but they were not put into the first agreement. So it would have been extremely hard. And there may have been some efforts, but certainly they would have been rebuffed by Tehran to add other elements to the JCPOA. Basically, the Iranians were quite, strong from the beginning that the only issue is a return to the former JCPOA. And, you know, what we've seen, by the way, with its demands on the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and the inspections and the investigation of the IAEA were not in the original agreement. So perhaps that's a case that the West made to why they were able to take it out. So unfortunately, these issues, even, you know, this is something that former Prime Minister Netanyahu said in 2015, ahead of the original signing, that, it should be broad. It should talk about Iranian regional aggression, its support for terrorist organizations. But these were things that were never seriously discussed, and certainly not in the final JCPOA. So it just was a non-starter to suddenly put them back in at this late stage.
Thanks so much. Murray Feldman actually follows up on that. What exactly does Gantz hope to accomplish in the U.S.? What would he like to see within a renewed JCPOA if it does go that way?
Well, I think at this point it's about the details. If the Americans have already sent off their response to the Iranian response to the European response, the likelihood of stopping it is minimal. So perhaps influencing maybe some details at this late stage. It's unlikely that there'll be details, but what's more likely is implementation. They'll be explaining to them, the Americans, exactly, watch this, watch that. Giving over maybe some more intelligence of where Iran is not going to implement the deal, where it has failed to in the past, and what it's been doing since. And also, there'll be one of the most important things is Gantz will be making the case to the Americans, as Lapid did today, and Bennett has before, and Netanyahu did before that Israel is not party to this deal. It does not feel itself constrained by any elements of the deal. And if it feels that Iran has got to the point of no return, if they feel that Iran is cheating and moving further towards a nuclear weapon capability, then it reserves the right to take whatever actions necessary. And that's a warning that the Americans certainly, Israel will want the Americans to hear in person, and see what the reaction is to that. The interesting thing is a Saudi newspaper based in London reported that a few months ago, Israel, some training exercises of the Israel Air Force actually entered Iranian airspace. Now, whether it did or not is less important at this point, by the fact that this was clearly leaked to try and put pressure to show that Israel does have the capability, if necessary, to strike Iran. This will certainly be a message that is sent to Washington, to London, to Paris, and to Berlin, to show that Israel is still preparing for the possibility, and Israel thinks a very strong possibility, that Iran will continue its nuclear weapons program, and it may get to a point where Israel will feel the need to stop it militarily.
Absolutely. So I'm sure you just answered this question, but Larry Greenberg asked in not so many words, has Israel publicly announced that it is not bound to any agreement to which it is not a party?
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, it's obvious if it's not a signatory to a deal, it's not bound by it. But I should caveat my previous remarks. What is clear is after the 2015 original JCPOA was signed, it did limit Israel's ability to a certain extent. Before that date, certainly America and Israel had worked quite a lot together covertly to try and neutralize some aspects of the Iranian nuclear program, whether it's through Stuxnet or some of the other programs that were put in to bring down certain elements, technological elements, et cetera, et cetera. Once the agreement was signed, what we did see from the Americans is certainly a massive step back from assisting and working with Israel and others to work against the Iranian nuclear program, and even a sort of message to Israel, we've got to give it a chance. And I think we'll be hearing the same sort of thing. So Israel's room for maneuver after the signing or the return or whatever it is to the JCPOA will be narrower. It will certainly not want to embarrass the Americans. The Americans won't want it to embarrass them. So certainly, while Israel will be saying that we will do everything necessary, they'll be certainly hearing from the Americans, give this agreement a chance, with a massive asterisk placed on that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So we've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week. For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Nadine Menza discussing fighting for religious freedom in the Middle East. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.